It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Maté. When is a supreme war crime not actually a crime? Well, perhaps when it's committed by the British government. Yes, that's the apparent decision made from the High Court in London. The court has effectively terminated a private prosecution brought against former Prime Minister Tony Blair and others for the Iraq invasion in 2003. The court determined that while customary international law does recognize the crime of aggression as the supreme war crime, no such offense exists under the law of England and Wales. Chris Nineham is vice chair of the Stop the War Coalition and author of The People versus Tony Blair, as well as the forthcoming How the Establishment Lost Control. Chris, welcome.
Hi, Aaron. How are you?
Thanks for joining us. So you have a piece up called Why the Blair Judgment is an Attack on Democracy. Can you explain?
Well, I think there's a lot of cynicism about this judgment, partly because the Attorney General at the time of the Iraq War, and the Attorney General in Britain is the sort of main judge, he was of the view, and he told Tony Blair privately, that he thought that there was such a crime as aggression under British law. So, and that was a private opinion that he gave to Tony Blair, and so presumably he was kind of saying what he really thought about the law. And the judge the barristers in the case that is currently at law have also argued very persuasively that actually there's all sorts of previous examples of where the crime of aggression has been taken as being part of British law. So I think there's a deep sense of scepticism about this judgment. Add to that the fact that there's been 101 different attempts to stop this and other cases coming to court. In fact, that the current Attorney General tried to stop this case coming because he said that Prime Ministers should be immune or above the law. There was the talk about this case shouldn't be heard because it might prejudice things that were supposed to be official secrets. So there's been a concerted and coordinated attempt to try and stop this attempt to get Tony Blair to justice and others by the establishment, which I think, if you take them together, suggests that, this isn't really about a technical question of the legal situation. It's actually much more about the establishment kind of closing ranks, because this issue of the Iraq war and this issue of Tony Blair's culpability is such a kind of an explosive question in British politics.
But Chris, on the legal aspect, you mentioned there being previous cases that would support this case currently brought against Blair. But didn't the court in this ruling cite a previous ruling from 2007?
Or 2006, I can't remember. But yes, they did. But there's other cases, there's other cases that could be used and were used in court by the kind of prosecution case to try and prove the opposite. For example, Britain was fully and legally involved in the Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War, and in that instance, the crime of aggression was constantly and frequently used as a means to convict people. That's just one example. There were a whole number of examples that were presented in the current case. So, at the very minimum, at the technical level, it's a moot point. And I think that when you combine that fact with as I say, the general sort of strategy of the ruling class, which is despite the findings of the Chilcot report, which was the report that came out last year, which was a damning report produced by an independent inquiry sort of establishment operation, which showed in detail that Tony Blair did in fact break international law on a whole number of instances. I think there's a feeling that that report has been kept as a dead letter. That report, for all its huge criticisms of Tony Blair and others around him, is not going to be acted on in any way. And that's the impression, and that's the sort of feeling that people get in Britain, that this man is really above the law. He's been proved guilty. Everyone knows he's guilty of a whole string of breaches of international law The point is he's not going to get charged. There is going to be no accountability, precisely because the politicians are worried about the level of scrutiny that puts them under in the future.
You know, Chris, it's interesting to compare what you say is an ongoing issue of Tony Blair's role in the Iraq War in Britain to how George W. Bush is looked at here in the U.S. Over the years, we've seen things like attempted citizens' arrests of Tony Blair. There's this case that we're talking about now. It's constantly talked about in the media. Compare that to the U.S., where Bush recently has gone under this sort of public image rehabilitation, especially because of the election of Donald Trump. And when he's profiled in the media, we hear about his paintings and so forth. He goes on the Ellen show, so even being embraced by liberals. But in Britain, activists like yourself have very much kept the focus on Tony Blair's record in Iraq and trying to hold him accountable. Can you talk about how that has played out so many years later after the initial invasion?
Well, I mean, there's two immediate reasons, I guess, for the difference. One is that Tony Blair has tried to continue to play a major role in not just in British but in international politics, which I guess George Bush hasn't done. I may be wrong about that, but that's one of the big problems. Is that, you know, apart from earning millions and millions of pounds off the back of his career as Prime Minister, he's also, you know, he's been part of the Quartet peace operation in the Middle East, so-called. He's been playing all sorts of roles in a series of NGOs. He's always getting himself, and by the way, being welcomed onto various different sort of top-end discussion shows on the BBC and elsewhere. So he's tried to continue to play a central role, sort of behind the scenes, but nevertheless central role in British politics, and I think that has really angered people. The other issue, I suppose, is that Britain has moved definitively to the left, really, in the last few years. I mean, it's a sort of complicated process, but the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party and the fact that he did quite well, you know, in the general election, I think underlines this point that there's a very, very deep-seated anti-war, kind of anti-neoliberal mood in Britain nowadays at a popular level. And I think this is, you know, Tony Blair is seen rightly by people as the main perpetrator of war, of the sort of series of wars that we've been involved in the last 15 or 16 years. And secondly, as one of the great champions of free market privatizing politics, which are now being rejected by at least the majority of people in this country. So, you know, he's a kind of convenient and justified kind of focus for people's anger and bitterness. Because I think people feel that those years, you know, were terrible years for British society during the Iraq War, and the sort of the way in which the Labour Party, which is supposed to be a social democratic party, became a kind of pale imitation of the Tory party and pursued Tory economic as well as foreign policy objectives. You know, I mean, I think people see that as a real low point, that British society was dragged very, very low, and there's now quite a gathering rebellion against it. So I guess that's the sort of broad brushstrokes of it. Right.
So on the point about the British establishment closing ranks to protect Blair from scrutiny, can you talk about how Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has broken from that?
Well, most importantly, just after he became leader of the Labour Party, and actually just after the Chilcot report was made public last year, Jeremy Corbyn organised a kind of public and formal apology for the Iraq War, which was an apology to the Iraqi people. It was the apology to the British people, to the soldiers, to society, the world at large, really, to say, you know, this was a terrible mistake. It should never have happened. And that was a very, very important symbolic moment, because it marked a kind of a turning point, at least from the point of view of the Labour leadership and certainly the membership of the Labour Party, that they really don't want to go back there. And so that sort of changed the general sort of attitude towards these things. And so I think everyone knows that the Labour leadership is not supporting this attempt to sort of, you know, to cover up and to apologise and to somehow let Tony Blair off the hook. And that's very, very important.
Okay, Chris, let me ask you about some of the criticism that I've seen about this attempt to prosecute Tony Blair. There's a piece by James Snell for the Middle East Eye, which argues two things. One, that because the case was brought by an Iraqi general who served under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, it's ridiculous for someone like that to bring a case against an elected leader. And second of all, he says that even the idea of trying to prosecute an elected leader basically rewards dictators like Saddam Hussein, who don't face the kind of legal scrutiny that someone like Tony Blair would in a democracy.
Well, I mean, I think both those arguments are, are very, very difficult to understand, even let alone to sustain. I mean, the main thing I'd say about that article, by the way, before coming on to the arguments, is that this is written by someone who thinks that the Iraq War was a good thing and says so. So, I mean, he's not really arguing a series of technical points. He's basically saying, I mean, in fact, one of the things he says, one of the reasons he gives for thinking that it's a bad thing for politicians to be legally accountable is that it might make more wars more difficult. So, that's very much, it's a very, very political, ideological position he's taking. But on the substantive points you make, I mean, first of all, it seems to me that the law, it has or is supposed to have an independent value, and it doesn't matter who brings a case to law. The case has to be looked at and judged on its merits. And that's surely an absolute basic principle of any kind of legal system that works. Secondly, the idea that politicians shouldn't be accountable to the law. Well, I mean, if they weren't, then it would make a mockery of the whole. I mean, one of the main thing that politicians do is make laws. So is James Snell seriously saying that those that make the law should somehow be immune from them? I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's a kind of ludicrous argument. As I say, what's really going on here, he doesn't like the idea. And this is what I meant by the whole thing about this is an attack on democracy. Really what this is about is it's about trying to limit the amount of scrutiny that various institutions in society can maintain on the political classes. The problem is that, it's true that there was a vote in Parliament in support of the Iraq War, but I mean, there was all sorts of problems with that vote, and the main one was it was taken on the basis of false information that was deliberately supplied by Tony Blair and others to Parliament. In other words, lies. So it wasn't a vote that was based on any real understanding of the situation.
That's right, Chris. When we talk about the Iraq War, we often forget that, the invasion was in March 2003. Well, about a year before that, in March 2002, it was then that Blair and Bush decided that they were going to invade Iraq and pursue regime change no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's, this is it's incredible that this isn't more part of the kind of narrative, because it's this is completely documented and the documents are in the public domain. An agreement was made, as you say, between the two main protagonists that this was going to be a war for regime change. Now, war for regime change is illegal. That's the main thing about this story. But the other thing is that this decision was not reported to anyone pretty much in Britain. It certainly wasn't reported to Parliament. It wasn't reported even to the cabinet, and clearly wasn't reported to the British people. So Tony Blair was operating on the basis of a tight agreement for a war for regime change, which is illegal, and he didn't tell anyone. And he claimed that he was still trying to make up his mind right up until the beginning of 2003 about whether to go to war or not. So
right, Chris. So listen, we just have 30 seconds. So let me ask you finally, where does the movement to hold Blair accountable go from here?
Well, I mean, it will continue with various legal cases that are still in the pipeline. But I think the main thing is to keep up the pressure politically and to keep up the pressure in terms of protests and so forth. I mean, the truth of the matter is Tony Blair can't really walk the streets of Britain without facing protests. And, the main purpose of this whole thing is to isolate him and to demoralize him and the people that support him, and to try and make sure that anyone who thinks about doing something like this again will know that there will be a massive public reaction and that their political career will be ruined. If we can't do that legally, we'll do it by protest and through political means.
Chris Nineham, Vice Chair of the Stop the War Coalition, author of The People versus Tony Blair, and the forthcoming book, How the Establishment Lost Control. His latest piece is called Why Blair Judgment is an Attack on Democracy. Chris, thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.